If the element of self-abandonment is missing from our Christian life, are we salt that has lost its flavor? And if we have lost our flavor, are we still going to make it to heaven? Find out in this episode. Thank you for tuning into God's Resistance. Glad to have you join us. We're continuing a series that has to do with once saved, always saved, conditional salvation, and the like. And we're going to be in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35, answering that question. If we are salt that has lost its flavor, are we still going to make it to heaven? What does Jesus say concerning this? And so let's just go right to the scripture. We read here, starting in Luke 14:25, and there went great multitudes with him, and he turned aside and said unto them, if any man come to me, let me switch translations here. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So this is a pretty sobering account, or I say teaching that Jesus has concerning, I believe, conditional salvation. Now, some people would say that this is just talking about the aspect of discipleship. I had mentioned that in previous episode, I believe 2 episodes before, saying that you can be saved and not be his disciple. But those two things are not divorced at all in the New Testament whatsoever. Christians throughout the centuries did not think like that. They believed that if you were a saved, a born-again Christian, you were a disciple. So these two things are wedded together. Jesus is talking to people and using logic as far as, he's talking about counting the cost to build a tower or an army and these kind of things to convey a point, right? And the point is, I believe if we go down here to verse 33, this is kind of the condition. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Another place in the scripture, Jesus had talked about if you don't hate father, mother, wife, brother, sister, all this close family ties, then you are not worthy to be my disciple. Now, does that mean that Jesus wants us to literally hate them? No, but if any of them come in the place of our allegiance before Christ, he's saying you need to love him more than even the closest ties. And so when he's talking about renouncing all things, he also talked about person carrying their cross. And that person, if you don't carry your cross, you're not worthy to be his disciple, which goes right back to verse 33. Any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. So that is the basis of the Christian life. And that was what I asked in the beginning, is if there's no self-abandonment to God in our lives, if that's missing, are we really true Christians? And are we salt that's lost its savor? And if we've lost that saltiness in our lives, are we ready for heaven? And so here, I would like to go through Jesus' reasoning and see how he is trying to convey this and simply just expound what's here. He said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now think about that. That's very difficult with close family ties, right? When it comes to disappointing them, you would want to be able to, especially if you're a Christian, you want to be able to please them in certain ways, but you realize if it comes up to it, Jesus is even more important to me than my closest family ties. And so he says things like father, mother, very close tie, wife or a husband, I should say in that matter, or even children, brothers and sisters. We've seen at times where it is the significant other that steers somebody away, or it's the children that start going in a certain direction and then the parents kind of slowly follow behind. And what has happened is there's been tremendous damage in people's lives. And where people had a deep spirituality, they suddenly start to take on the world and they start to have a shallowness about them, and they start to lose out. And this is what I believe Jesus is talking about. The saltiness of their life is absent. It used to be there, but it's not. And it's because it's these close family ties, father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, that get in the way. And if it's not that, he said, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So sometimes it's people's personal ambitions. They want to be somebody, they want to do a certain thing, and they allow those things to get in the way of their allegiance to Jesus Christ. And in so doing, they love themselves more than they love God. Now, that's not to say that you and I don't do things that we like or that we love. There's nothing wrong with those things. But he's saying if it's threatening your allegiance, if it's getting in the way, then you must push those things aside. You must forsake all those things. And Jesus is that pearl of great price, and you follow after him. He's worth all things. He's worth the loss of all things in this life so that you can gain him forever in eternity. That is the sentiment behind this. And he says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So it could be that your family is totally fine with you being a Christian, and maybe even some of them have been saved, been born again, they're converted, and they're walking in that light, right? So maybe you don't have to bear this cross, but there's some people that do. And whatever cross it is that you have, and the cross is something of that heavy burden, that disagreeable thing that is happening right now because you're going to follow Jesus. He's saying, don't just throw that off when the burden gets heavy. Press into him more. Hold on to your cross, right? Bear it. He's given it to you. And he's saying, if I bore the cross and you're following after me, you have a cross to bear as well. And I want you to follow me. And he says, if we don't do that and we love our lives more than we love Jesus Christ, then we're not worthy to be his disciple. Those are heavy words, especially when you think about your life being threatened. And there's people whose lives are being threatened all throughout the globe right now, and of course throughout history, and they love not their lives even unto the death, the scripture tells us. And we need to have that sort of love inside of our own hearts. And you may say, I'm not that kind of person. You know, I remember reading about Richard Wurmbrand, and he was saying when he was first cast into a communist prison, he looked out of this window of his cell and he saw people being beaten out there. And he said, oh God, I don't have what it takes to be this type of Christian. And so he asked God for help. And you know what? God did help him. God gave him grace. And for 14 years, he was in a communist prison, tortured, and terrible things that had happened to him. And God gave him strength that he himself didn't have. So it's not up to us like we're somehow some really strong people. It's just that our resolve, our decision has been made that, Lord, whatever happens, you are most important in my life. You have my highest allegiance, and I will trust you to give me the grace to make all of that a reality in my life as I walk this out. And so then we say, or he talks about this with the closest ties, and then he talks about the cost of salvation. Now, oftentimes people say there is no cost of salvation. It's a free gift. It's kind of a paradox in the scriptures because it talks about it being a free gift. There's nothing we can do to earn it. But then he says it's costly because it costs us everything. It costs all of our ambitions in life. It costs the closest family ties. It costs all of those things. And we have to see Jesus as that pearl of great price, or that field that's so valuable with a buried treasure in it that we'd sell everything we have just to have it. He's saying it's costly, and yet my salvation's a free gift. So that is the paradox. But he goes to making this illustration in verse 30. He says, in verse 28, for which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Now, I remember when I was younger, I lived in Western Massachusetts. We would have to drive. We were about 10 or 15 minutes outside of a place that would have grocery shopping and whatnot. We were out in the country. And this road that we had to drive in was a main road. And I remember always looking off to the side of this one house. It looked like they had built a foundation. And then a little while later, they had put wood on top to build the framing and stud work over the top so that they could rest the house on top of the concrete foundation that they poured. And yet it seemed like it did that and they put a floor over it, but there was no walls, there was no roof, there was no nothing. And it was like that for a few years. It didn't appear to be that they were making any progress whatsoever. And I thought to myself, I remember this when I was younger, thinking, why did they start doing that? Why didn't they finish, And why do they not have enough money to finish? I remember asking my parents things like that. This is something of the sentiment that Jesus is talking about. Who goes to build a tower or some great building and doesn't first check to see if he's got the finances and materials to be able to do this, and even the manpower, right? We think about huge buildings that are in New York City and such. Who would say, we're going to break ground, we're going to do this great building, build all this hype up behind it, and then go, oh man, I don't have the money to finish this? Everyone would look at that person and say, what a fool. Why didn't he do that? And Jesus is saying to us, count the cost. Count the cost. It's going to cost you your closest ties. It's going to cost you all of your plans and wishes and ambitions in life to bow to Christ and to his kingdom. Are you willing to part with all of that to have the pearl of great price? It's going to cost you, right? And oftentimes in this day and age, we think being a Christian, it doesn't cost anything. It's just such a free gift that everything's just so wonderful, but it does cost. We have to say, Jesus is most important to me. It's not that we're earning our salvation. It's that we're parting with everything else that would get in the way of me grabbing hold of Jesus in full faith and trust in him, right? That is the issue. And we move on, and he gives another illustration that kind of brings out the same point. What king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he's able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So he's saying even the same thing in a military setting. They're thinking about this battle they've got to fight. They say, well, here's the men we have. And then they think about their men's capabilities. Are these valiant men? Are they men of war? Do they know what they're doing? How does this stack up? Because those people have twice as many people as we do. What are we going to do about all this? And so they think about it. They probably have their generals. They have advisors and certain people around as they look through all of it. And then finally, they've got to make a decision. Do we have what it takes to engage these in war? Do we have any chance that we are going to come out victorious? Or am I leading my men into certain death? Is this cause worth fighting for? And if it's not, and we can't do it, then maybe we need to go and negotiate and get some terms of peace, right? He's saying this is normal. We see that in life, but somehow we think about this differently when it gets to the place of salvation. We think that we don't have to think in those terms. And yet Jesus says you do have to think in those terms. And remember that central point I was saying before, any one of you in verse 33 who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. That is the Christian life. That is the heart of a Christian, is to renounce everything else so that you can be his disciple. And being saved and being his disciple are one and the same thing in Jesus' mind. They're not two separate things like some would like us to believe. So then we come up to the point about the salt, right? Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Well, as far as I know, there's no way to make salt, unsalty salt, salty again, right? It's like one of those rhetorical questions Jesus is asking. How are we going to make the salt salty again, right? And I don't know about you, but if you're trying to put salt on food and whatever you pour on there doesn't give that saltiness, it's a little disappointing. Some of the food is quite bland. The salt does help and enhance all of that, but if it's not salty, there's really no good use for it. And that's what Jesus is getting at. Because then if you go in verse 35, he says, it is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So it doesn't do any good for soil and growing vegetables. It doesn't even help in the composting of the manure pile. It's literally useless, right? And so he is equating the Christian life that is not one that has renounced all things, that has taken up the cross and followed him, that has cut all the close family ties that have come to threaten their allegiance to Jesus. Any of those things that are in the way, the person who hasn't renounced all to follow Jesus and to be his disciple is like this salt, that it's lost its flavor. And he says, it is good for nothing. It's thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So what does that mean? That means that if we don't have that salt in us, we're not really Christians. Or if we were Christians, we've backslidden and now we've lost the saltiness. The savor of our Christian life is missing. And he's saying there is no use for it. It's good for nothing but to be thrown out, right? To be thrown out. And then he says, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. In other words, you need to listen to this right now. There is danger up ahead, right? So don't just think that, oh, I've lost my saltiness, so I'll just lose my reward in heaven. Did a video about that last week. But realize that heaven is at stake. You must be salty. If you've enjoyed this video, then I would like you to like, comment, subscribe, and so you can get notifications there. Visit www.godsresistance.com. And until next time, stay salty.